If I told you that you were living in the final stage of a collapsing empire, and that what is happening right now, this very minute, has happened in exactly the same way to Rome before it fell, to the British Empire before it lost all its power, and to the Soviet Union before it collapsed overnight, would you believe me?
Because while you're watching this video, while millions of Americans are worried about this month's electricity bill, about gas prices, about whether they'll ever be able to buy a home, there's a larger, darker, more important reality unfolding underneath, one that almost no one can see in full. And that reality is this: America, the world's dominant empire for the last 80 years, is repeating, step by step, sign by sign, the final phase of every declining empire in human history. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. I'm not talking about prophecy or doomsday predictions. I'm talking about data, numbers you can't argue with, trends you can't reverse, historical patterns that have repeated for thousands of years and are reappearing right in front of us. Today, I'm going to show you 6 warning signs, and after this video, you will never look at the news, economic policy, or your own future the same way again, because once you see this pattern, you'll see it everywhere, and you'll understand why life is getting harder for you, not by accident, not because you're not trying hard enough, but because you're living inside a system that is shifting from creating prosperity to distributing pain. The scariest part isn't that it's happening. The scariest part is that most people don't realize it until it's too late. So the only question you need to answer over the next 20 minutes is this: will you be someone who sees it early, or someone who wakes up after everything has already collapsed? Sign 1, the empire stops expanding, and that's when the countdown begins. Let's start with a rule of history that has no exceptions. A healthy empire is always expanding territory, influence, markets, power. A dying empire clings to what's left and tries not to let it slip away. And here's what almost no one tells you: America stopped expanding a long time ago. Now it's in maintenance mode, in hold mode, not conquer mode. And that is exactly the phase Rome entered before it fell, the phase the British Empire entered after World War II, the phase the Soviet Union entered in the 1980s. Look at this number and let it sink in. In 2024, America's goods trade deficit hit $1.2 trillion. That is not a surplus. That is a deficit, meaning the U.S. buys $1.2 trillion more from the world than it sells every year. And if you think, oh, maybe that's just China, listen to this. The deficit with China was $295 billion, with Mexico $172 billion, with the EU $235 billion. In other words, America runs deficits with almost all of its major trading partners. Meanwhile, and this is the part you need to pay attention to, global trade in 2024 grew 3.3% to nearly $33 trillion. But who is leading that growth? Who is expanding economic influence? Who is capturing new market share? Not the United States. China's export volumes rose 12%. Countries across the global south are building new trade networks, forming new economic alliances that don't require the US dollar. But this isn't only about trade. It's about a much bigger question. How is America producing growth? In 2024, US GDP grew around 2.3%. Sounds fine, right? But when you dig into that number, you find something alarming. That growth didn't come from America producing more. It didn't come from exporting more. It didn't come from building new factories or inventing breakthrough technologies. It came from 2 things: consumption and debt. And when an economy can only grow by spending more and borrowing more, rather than producing more, that's when you know the real engine of growth is dead. And on debt, let me show you a number that will make you understand why I'm calling this the end phase. U.S. national debt is now $38 trillion. Read that again, $38 trillion. That's 124% of GDP, the highest in America's peacetime history. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, it's projected to rise to 156% of GDP by 2055. That means in 30 years, the U.S. government will owe 1.5 times the total value of its entire economy. Now, let me tell you what happened to Rome when it fell into a similar situation. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Rome stopped expanding. It could no longer conquer new territory. No new spoils of war, no new slaves, no new gold. And once an empire stops expanding, it faces an unsolvable problem. How do you maintain a massive empire, military, administration, infrastructure, when revenue no longer grows? Rome's answer was to raise taxes, debase the currency, cut public spending, and eventually borrow relentlessly until the whole system collapsed. And that's exactly what America is doing right now. So who pays the price when an empire stops expanding? Not the elites, not the people who hold power and assets. It's ordinary workers, the middle class, people without stocks, without real estate, without financial assets. Because when there's no new pie being baked, when no new opportunities are being created, the game shifts from who can earn more to who can hold on to more. And in that game, the people who started with nothing lose everything. Sign 2. Power. No longer creates prosperity. It only creates despair. Now, I'm going to say something you felt for years, even if you didn't have the words for it. Your life isn't getting better even if you work harder, even if the economy grows, even if the stock market hits record highs, even if politicians insist everything is fine. And this isn't your imagination or your pessimism. This is hard statistical data recorded by the US government itself. And when you look at these numbers, you'll understand why more and more young people are losing faith in the system. According to the latest data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics from July 2024 to July 2025, nominal wages, the number on your paycheck, rose 4.2%. Sounds good, right? But wait, inflation over the same period was 2.7%. That means real wages, your actual purchasing power, rose only 1.5%. And if you think, at least it's still rising, let me show you why that 1.5% is a cruel joke. Because while your real wages rose 1.5%, housing costs have risen 50% since 2017. Home prices are up 80% since 2017. Healthcare costs are up 41% just for silver plans on the ACA marketplace. Childcare costs are up 40% since 2017. And if you're thinking, at least I can save money by cooking at home, I'm sorry to tell you that average monthly food costs have risen 32% since 2019, while wages rose only 29%. Do you see the problem? Wages creep up, but the things you need to live, housing, healthcare, food, childcare, rise 10 times faster, 20 times faster, 50 times faster. And that's why you might be earning more on paper than last year, but you feel poorer. You feel life getting harder. You feel like you're falling behind. And here's what no one tells you. This isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. Because when an empire weakens, when power can no longer generate new wealth, power starts operating like an extraction machine. It begins pulling value from the very people it claims to protect. And it doesn't do it through obvious laws or openly declared policies. It does it through quiet inflation, through hidden cost increases, through hundreds of fees and indirect taxes you don't even realize you're paying. Let me tell you about the British Empire in the early 20th century, because the similarity to America today is frightening. In 1900, Britain was still the largest empire on Earth. It controlled a quarter of the planet's land, a quarter of the world's population. It had the strongest navy, one of the biggest economies, and the pound was the global reserve currency, just like America today. And yet, working class life didn't improve. Inequality grew. The cost of living rose. And the working class developed a stronger sense of class consciousness, began demanding change, began asking why they had to struggle while their empire was supposedly prosperous. And do you know what happened next? The British Empire didn't collapse because it lost a single decisive battle. It didn't collapse because an enemy conquered it. It collapsed because it could no longer maintain an empire while also improving the lives of its own people. Eventually, it had to choose, and it chose to give up the empire. America is facing the same choice now. The only difference is that it hasn't realized it yet. So, who's paying the price? A study by the Urban Institute found that 52% of Americans lack the resources to afford basic economic security in their communities. Read that again. More than half the population can't afford a secure standard of living. And these aren't unemployed people or the homeless. These are people with jobs, people who go to work every day, people who pay taxes and still can't afford to live safely. Sign 3. The empire shifts from creating to distributing pain, and you're in the line of fire. Now we come to the most important part, the core of the whole story. Once you understand this, you'll understand everything happening around you. When an empire is strong, it creates new wealth. It builds things that never existed. It opens new opportunities. It makes the pie bigger so everyone can get a slice. But when an empire weakens, it stops creating. And instead, it begins a brutal game, deciding who will suffer first, who will lose more, who will be sacrificed so others can maintain their lifestyle. And that's exactly what is happening in America right now. But it's happening quietly, subtly, slowly, so slowly that most people don't realize it until they find themselves asking, why is my life getting harder even though I'm doing everything right? Look at how U.S. economic policy has changed over the past 20 or 30 years, and you'll see a clear pattern. No more major productivity reforms like the interstate highway system after World War II that opened opportunity for millions. No more massive investments in higher education like the GI Bill that created the largest middle class in history. No more broad-based technology breakthroughs like the 1980s to 1990s information revolution that created millions of new jobs. Instead, policy is now focused on managing decline, managing crisis, managing who will pay the price. And it does this through 3 main tools, and I want you to remember them because they affect you every day. First, indirect taxation, not income tax or corporate tax that politicians have to vote on openly, but hundreds of fees, permits, compliance costs, and charges you don't even realize you're paying. Second, inflation, the most sophisticated way to extract value from the public because it erodes your savings without passing a single law. Third, rising costs in essential sectors like healthcare, education, and housing, things you can't opt out of, things the market no longer truly competes on. Let me give you a concrete number to show the scale. In 2024, U.S. interest payments on the national debt alone totaled $892 billion, 3.1% of GDP, the highest since 1991. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, that number is projected to rise to $1.8 trillion by 2035. Read that again. $1.8 trillion just to pay interest, not even the principal. And here's what you need to understand. In 2024, America spent more on interest than it spent on defense, more than it spent on education, more than it spent on infrastructure. That means a large portion of every tax dollar you pay isn't building the future, isn't investing in your children, isn't improving your life. It's paying for yesterday's borrowing. It's maintaining an outdated system. It's extending the death of an empire. Do you know what Rome did in a similar situation? In the 3rd century, when Rome could no longer expand and no longer had spoils from war, it faced a massive fiscal crisis. How do you maintain the army, the administration, the empire, when the treasury is empty? Their solution was currency debasement. They began mixing cheaper metals into the silver denarius, slowly, year after year, until the denarius contained only 5% silver instead of nearly all silver before. And what happened? Inflation exploded. Prices soared. People lost faith in the currency. The economy collapsed. And eventually the empire fractured. America is doing the same thing through unlimited money creation and unlimited debt. So who pays? Urban poor, who spend a larger share of income on food and energy and are hit hardest by inflation. People without assets, because inflation lifts the price of real estate and stocks while wages lag behind. And cash holders, the savers, people who think they're doing the right thing by saving for the future, not realizing the purchasing power of their money is shrinking every day. This isn't simply bad policy or mistakes. This is the nature of an empire in decline. When it can no longer create new wealth, it extracts from the weakest. Sign 4. Power turns inward, the sign of fear. There's a rule of history you need to understand because it's unfolding right now. A confident empire projects power outward. It wants the world open because it believes it will win under open competition. But a fearful empire turns power inward. It closes borders, builds barriers, controls, restricts, bans, because it knows that if the game is truly open, it will lose. And America is doing exactly this right now, and the speed at which it's turning inward is accelerating dangerously. Look at economic policy over the past few years and you'll see the pattern. Tighter trade controls through waves of new tariffs, tighter technology controls through restrictions on exporting advanced semiconductors to China and other countries. Tighter supply chain controls through buy domestic and reshoring requirements. And all of it is wrapped in a label that sounds completely legitimate, national security. But is this really about national security, or is it about hiding weakness in competition?
In 2025, the Trump administration rolled out a broad wave of tariffs, claiming it would protect American jobs, reduce the trade deficit, and make America great again. It sounds heroic. But what is the real-world result? Economic research suggests these tariffs will add roughly $30 billion a year to the cost of home construction, reduce housing supply at a time when America is already short on homes, raise the prices of imported food when living costs are already sky high, and ultimately hurt American consumers more than they help. But here's the most important thing I want you to understand. This is not the policy of a confident empire. This is the policy of an empire in defensive mode, an empire that is afraid and losing competitiveness. Look back at history. In the 19th century, when Britain was the strongest power in the world, it championed free trade because it knew its industrial advantage would dominate any open market. It wanted the world open because openness benefited Britain. But by the early 20th century, when Germany and the United States began surpassing Britain in industrial production, Britain shifted toward protectionism, favoring its colonies, closing in. Late-stage Rome did the same. It tightened price controls through Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, tried to control every aspect of the economy, restricted freedom of movement, forced children to inherit their parents' occupations. Clear signs of an empire no longer strong enough to maintain power through competence and attraction, and forced instead to rely on coercion and control. And the Soviet Union? It built the Berlin Wall not to keep outsiders out, but to keep its own citizens in. So who pays when power turns inward? Consumers, because they have fewer choices and pay higher prices for lower quality. Small businesses, because they lose access to cheaper global inputs and don't have the scale to manufacture domestically at competitive cost. And service workers, who are hit hardest by rising living costs while receiving none of the benefits of protection because their jobs aren't the ones being outsourced. Sign 5. An outside enemy is used to hide internal weakness, and you're the one being played. Now, I'm going to say something that might make you angry. You might push back. But after you hear the logic and the evidence, I think you'll have to admit something is deeply wrong. America's most serious structural problems are being concealed, redirected, and blamed on an external enemy. And that enemy is China. Unemployment rises? China stole our jobs. Inflation spikes? China disrupted the supply chain. The trade deficit? China plays unfair, subsidizes firms, manipulates currency. America falls behind in tech? China steals intellectual property. Wages stagnate? China competes with cheap labor. Sound familiar? Because that's the narrative you hear every day, from politicians, from the media, from both parties. And it's effective because it gives you a visible enemy, a simple explanation, something to blame, so you don't have to face a far more complex and painful truth. But look at America's real structural problems and ask yourself, did China cause these? U.S. productivity hasn't improved meaningfully in 20 years. Is that China's fault? No, that's a result of underinvestment in training and education, lack of innovation in traditional manufacturing, and an excessive focus on financialization instead of real production. America's infrastructure is severely degraded, graded C- by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Is that China's fault? No, that's decades of underinvestment, prioritizing tax cuts over building, a political system unable to pass major projects. Healthcare, education, and housing costs are exploding while wages stagnate. Is that China's fault? No, those are internal problems. One of the least efficient healthcare systems in the developed world, college costs inflated by a distorted student loan system, a housing market warped by zoning and construction restrictions. But it's much easier to blame China than to face these internal failures. And this is not new in the history of empires. Rome blamed the barbarians as its economy collapsed. But the truth was internal: corruption, inability to reform, class division, currency debasement. Britain blamed Germany as it lost economic position. But the truth was internal: failure to invest in new technologies, a rigid class system that blocked innovation, an over-focus on London finance instead of industry. The Soviet Union blamed Western plots for stagnation, but the truth was internal: inefficient central planning, lack of incentives to innovate, corruption, and bureaucracy. When an empire is healthy, an enemy is a competitor, a challenge to overcome. When an empire is weakening, an enemy becomes an excuse, somewhere to dump blame, a way to hide its own failures.
So who pays for this narrative? The people who believe it, who are tricked into thinking the problem is outside, not inside, and therefore support policies that don't solve the real issues. Taxpayers, whose resources are spent on countering China, military buildup, tariffs, sanctions, instead of education, infrastructure, and healthcare. And the people who are told to sacrifice a little more for national security, for the fight against the enemy, while their lives never actually improve. 6. The empire. No longer promises a future, only survival. And now we reach the final sign, the one you won't be able to unsee once you recognize it. You'll hear it everywhere, in political speeches, economic policy, news headlines. The language of America's leadership no longer describes a better future. It only talks about avoiding disaster. Listen carefully to the language used by the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, politicians, when they talk about the economy, soft landing, avoid a recession, avoid collapse, don't let things get worse, manage risk, control the damage, contain crisis, stop it from spreading. Do you notice? Not one of those phrases is about making life better. They're all about making it not worse. And this isn't random. It isn't an unlucky choice of words. It's an honest reflection of the reality leaders face. They no longer have the tools, the policies, the capacity to create a better future. So all they can promise is maintenance, stability, not letting things deteriorate. Compare that to the past and you'll see how painful the difference is. In the 1950s and 1960s, American policy promised the American dream, the idea that if you worked hard, you could own a home, raise a family, send your kids to college, retire comfortably, and the next generation would live better than you. In the 1990s, in the internet era, the promise was that technology would liberate people, create shared prosperity, connect the world, open limitless opportunities. Even in the 2000s and 2010s, after the financial crisis, there was still hope of recovery, of rebuilding, of reform. But now, permanent crisis mode. Every few years, a new crisis. The 2008 financial crisis, the 2011 European debt crisis, the 2018 trade crisis, the 2020 COVID crisis, the 2022 inflation crisis, the 2023 banking crisis. Each crisis demands emergency measures, temporary sacrifice, patience. But after each crisis, life never returns to the old normal. It just shifts to a new normal that's slightly worse. And we accept that as normal until the next crisis hits. And here's the most frightening part: when a system can only promise not worse, That means it passed its peak long ago. Now it's on a downward path that can't be reversed. So who pays? Young generations, Gen Z and millennials, pay the heaviest price because across survey after survey, most no longer believe in the American dream. Most don't believe they'll live better than their parents. Most don't believe they'll ever own a home. They don't believe retirement systems will still exist when they're old. They don't believe in the future. And when a generation loses faith in the future, that society is spiritually dead, even if it still exists materially. People without assets pay too. Because when the goal is only stability, those who already have assets, real estate, stocks, bonds, keep their value through policies like quantitative easing and low rates, while those who have nothing never get a chance to catch up because there's no real growth creating new opportunity. And finally, all of us pay the price of living in permanent crisis mode, always tense, always anxious, always bracing for the next shock, always being told to try a little harder just to stay in place, let alone move forward. And that is the final sign of an empire collapsing, not through bombs, not through military defeat, but through the loss of hope. When people no longer believe in the future, the empire is already dead in their minds, and everything after that is just a matter of time. So after these 20 minutes, after we've gone through 6 signs, after we've seen the numbers, the patterns, the historical comparisons, the only question left is, so what? What are you going to do with this information? I'm not standing here telling you America will collapse tomorrow or next year or even in the next decade, because empires don't collapse overnight. They collapse over decades, over generations, through hundreds of small decisions piling up until one day people look back and say, how did we not see this coming? But what I'm telling you is this, the signs are there. All 6 signs that every declining empire has shown are happening in America right now, at this very moment. The empire stops expanding and shifts to maintenance. Power no longer creates prosperity, it creates inequality. The system shifts from creating to distributing pain. Power turns inward out of fear of competition. An external enemy is used to hide internal weakness. And finally, no one promises a better future anymore, only survival through the next crisis. It's all happening. It can all be proven with data, and if you've watched this far, you've seen the evidence. So the question isn't, will this happen? The question is, who will pay the price? And more importantly, how will you prepare? Because history doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes in terrifying ways. And the poem of imperial collapse is one humanity has heard too many times. Each time, most people say, this time is different, until they realize it isn't. Not at all. If you found this video useful, if it made you see things in a new way, like and share it so more people can see what's happening, and most importantly, comment below. Do you think America is in its final stage? What will you do to prepare? Because this conversation matters more than any video.